James Carter was no stranger to adventure, but nothing in his 19 years of life had prepared him for this. When he first met Victoria Sinclair, it was at a local gym, of all places. She was striking. Her toned figure, sharp features, and self-assured demeanor made her impossible to ignore. At 42, she radiated a confidence and elegance that stood out among the younger crowd. James couldn't believe his luck when she started a casual conversation with him near the weights rack. What began as harmless small talk quickly evolved into something deeper. Victoria was charming, intelligent, and worldly in ways that fascinated James. She talked about art, travel, and life with a passion that he found intoxicating. Soon, their gym chats turned into coffee dates, and coffee dates turned into something more. It wasn't long before Victoria revealed the truth about her life. She was married to a successful businessman who traveled often for work. She had a son, only a year older than James, who was away at college most of the time. Despite the risks, she made it clear that she had no intention of leaving her husband. "He's my stability," she explained, her green eyes locking with his. "But you, James, you're my escape." James was conflicted but too captivated to walk away. There was something thrilling about being with Victoria, something that made him feel special in ways no one his age ever had. She introduced him to a world of fine dining, luxury hotels, and experiences he could have only dreamed of. She was like a secret fire in his otherwise predictable life. But every so often, as he lay in bed after one of their rendezvous, a nagging thought crept into his mind. How long can this really last? And what will happen when it ends? Their arrangement seemed perfect, at least for a time. Victoria's husband traveled frequently, often leaving for weeks at a time, and James filled the void she claimed to feel. They met in discreet hotels or out-of-town restaurants where no one would recognize them. She encouraged him to explore his own passions, asking about his future dreams and ambitions. Victoria made James feel seen in a way he never had before. But as intoxicating as their connection was, the reality of Victoria's double life was never far from his mind. James found himself wondering about her husband and son. Did they suspect anything? Could they sense the growing divide in their family? The first time James saw a photo of Victoria's family was by accident. She had left her phone on the hotel bed, and a notification lit up the screen. It was a picture of her husband and son, smiling together on a fishing trip. Her son, Nathan, looked just like her, dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and the same piercing green eyes. James felt a pang of unease. Nathan was only a year older than him, a fact that suddenly made their entire situation feel more surreal. "Something wrong?" Victoria asked as she stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her. James hesitated, then held up her phone. "Your family," he said quietly. "Do they have any idea?" Victoria sighed, sitting down beside him. "No, they don't. And I intend to keep it that way. My husband is too busy with his work to notice, and Nathan has his own life now. I'm careful, James. You don't need to worry." But James did worry. He worried about what would happen if they were caught, about the fallout that would undoubtedly follow. And yet, despite his unease, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Victoria was like a drug he couldn't quit, no matter how dangerous it was. The first real crack in their carefully constructed world came during one of their usual hotel meetups. They were lounging on the bed, Victoria scrolling through her phone while James toyed with the idea of what they'd order for dinner. That's when Victoria's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately tensed. "It's Nathan," she said, her voice unusually sharp. "I need to take this." James nodded and watched as she stepped out onto the balcony, her tone shifting into something maternal and affectionate. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, her voice muffled by the glass door. James tried not to listen, but fragments of the conversation slipped through. Nathan was upset about something that sounded serious. Victoria's responses were calm but firm, her maternal instincts kicking in. When she returned, her expression was troubled. "Everything okay?" James asked cautiously. Victoria nodded but didn't elaborate. "It's just family stuff," she said, brushing it off. "Nothing to worry about." But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Over the next few weeks, Victoria seemed more distracted, her mind elsewhere even when they were together. He began to wonder if Nathan was starting to suspect something. The possibility made James uneasy, but he didn't dare ask. Then, one evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of a restaurant, Victoria's phone buzzed with another call. She glanced at it and quickly silenced it, but James caught a glimpse of the name on the screen. Nathan. "Is everything okay with your son?" James asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Victoria hesitated, then sighed. "He's just been clingy lately," she said. "I think he's having trouble adjusting to being back home." James raised an eyebrow. "Back home?" "Yes," she said. "Nathan's taking a semester off from college. He's staying with us for now." The news hit James like a punch to the gut. If Nathan was back home, it meant he'd be around more often, and the chances of their secret being exposed were higher than ever. James's worst fears began to materialize a few weeks later. He and Victoria had planned another rendezvous, but she texted him at the last minute to cancel. "Nathan is here. Can't leave the house tonight. I'll make it up to you soon." James felt a mix of frustration and unease. He hadn't signed up for this kind of uncertainty. As much as he cared for Victoria, the risk was becoming harder to ignore. The situation escalated when Nathan himself entered the picture, quite literally. One evening, as James scrolled through social media, he stumbled across a photo Nathan had posted. It was a picture of Victoria in their living room, laughing as she held a glass of wine. The caption read, "Home sweet home with Mom." For the first time, James felt a wave of guilt he couldn't suppress. Nathan wasn't just a face in a photo anymore. He was a real person, a young man close to James's own age. And he had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. The turning point came when James received a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow at noon. Alone." James's heart raced as he stared at the message. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him it wasn't a coincidence. Against his better judgment, he decided to go. When he arrived at the park the next day, he saw Nathan sitting on a bench, his expression cold and unreadable. James's stomach dropped. "So," Nathan said as James approached, "you're the guy my mom's been sneaking around with." James froze, unable to speak. Nathan's piercing green eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the two young men simply stared at each other. "I've known for a while," Nathan said, his voice calm but edged with anger. "My mom thinks she's subtle, but she's not. I saw her texts. I saw the hotel receipts. And then I saw you." James swallowed hard. "Nathan, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Save it," Nathan snapped. "You think I care about your excuses? You're sleeping with my mother. You've already crossed every line." James felt a rush of shame but also a flicker of defiance. "I care about her," he said quietly. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Nathan laughed bitterly. "You care about her? What about me? What about my dad? Do we not matter?" Before James could respond, Nathan stood up, his expression hardening. "You're going to end this," he said. "No. Or I will." James nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and guilt. "Okay," he said. "I'll end it." Nathan nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are." As Nathan walked away, James felt the weight of his choices crashing down on him. He knew he had to end things with Victoria, for her sake, for Nathan's, and for his own. That evening, he met Victoria one last time. As they sat together in the dimly lit hotel room, he told her everything, about Nathan, about his guilt, about why they couldn't continue. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. "I understand," she said softly. "This was always temporary, wasn't it?" James nodded, his heart heavy. "I'll never forget you," he said. And with that, their story came to an end. James walked away, vowing to learn from his mistakes and never look back. But the memory of Victoria, the woman who had been his greatest thrill and his greatest regret, would stay with him forever. James walked away from Victoria for good, but the aftermath of their affair lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. For weeks, he replayed the conversation with Nathan in his mind, the cold intensity of his words, the shame that washed over him when he realized the extent of the damage he had caused. But it wasn't just Nathan's warning that haunted him, it was the look on Victoria's face during their final meeting. For the first time, she hadn't been the composed, confident woman he had fallen for. She had been vulnerable, her eyes brimming with tears as she whispered, I understand. James tried to immerse himself in work and school, hoping to bury the guilt under a mountain of responsibilities. But no matter how hard he tried to move on, reminders of Victoria and Nathan seemed to pop up everywhere. He stopped going to the gym where they had met, fearing he might see her again. He even avoided social media, terrified that Nathan might have followed through on his threat to expose the affair. His anxiety reached its peak one day when an unfamiliar car pulled into his driveway. James's heart dropped as Nathan stepped out, his expression unreadable. James hesitated, unsure if he should run, confront him, or simply wait for whatever was about to happen. Nathan didn't bother knocking. He walked straight up to James, his stance calm but commanding. "We need to talk," he said. James swallowed hard but nodded, stepping aside to let Nathan in. Nathan sat across from James in the living room, his arms crossed as he studied him. "I gave you the chance to end things," Nathan began. "And from what I've seen, you held up your end of the deal." James nodded cautiously. "I did. It's over." "Good," Nathan said. "Because you have no idea how close I was to ruining you. My dad might be oblivious, but I'm not. And if I thought for 1 second you were still sneaking around with her—" He let the sentence hang, the unspoken threat heavy in the air. James felt a wave of relief but also a twinge of anger. "I ended it because it was the right thing to do," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Not because of your threats. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Nathan leaned forward, his green eyes narrowing. "You already did, James. You hurt my family. You hurt me. And you hurt her, whether you realize it or not." James opened his mouth to respond, but Nathan cut him off. "You think this was just some fling for her? You think she'll just go back to her life like nothing happened? She won't. You became her escape, and now you've left her with nothing." The weight of Nathan's words hit James like a ton of bricks. He had ended the affair to protect himself and spare Nathan's family more pain, but he hadn't considered what it would do to Victoria. The thought of her being alone, trapped in a marriage she had described as suffocating, filled him with guilt. "I'm sorry," James said quietly. "For everything." Nathan stood, his expression softening just slightly. "You should be. But you've done enough damage. Stay away from my family. For good." And with that, Nathan left, leaving James to sit in the silence of his own regret. While James wrestled with his guilt, Victoria was fighting a battle of her own. Without James, her life felt emptier than ever. She had tried to convince herself that their affair was nothing more than a distraction, but the truth was far more complicated. James had given her something she hadn't felt in years: freedom, passion, a reminder that she was still alive. Now, that reminder was gone, and she was left with the cold reality of her marriage. Her husband, Richard, remained as absent as ever, his business trips taking precedence over their relationship. And Nathan, while more present in her life since taking a break from college, had grown distant. Victoria could feel the tension in the air whenever they were together, but she didn't dare confront him. She knew he knew. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, her phone buzzed with a message. For a brief, foolish moment, she hoped it was James. But when she checked, it was Nathan. "We need to talk." Victoria's heart sank. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she wasn't ready for it. "Still," she texted back, "Okay. I'm here." A few minutes later, Nathan walked into the room, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mom," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I know about James." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. "Nathan, I—" "Don't," he said, cutting her off. "Don't try to explain it or justify it. I need to know why." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes as she searched for the right words. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I was lonely. Your father is always gone, and when he's here, he barely notices me. I felt invisible. And then James came along, and for the first time in years, I felt like I mattered." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Do you realize what you've done? To Dad. To me. You tore this family apart." "I know," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "I know I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But Nathan, you have to understand, I didn't do this to hurt you. I was just trying to survive." Nathan stood, his expression hardening. Survive? You think this was survival? You were selfish, Mom. And now we all have to deal with the fallout. He turned to leave but stopped in the doorway. I love you, Mom. But I don't know if I can forgive you. As Nathan walked away, Victoria felt the full weight of her actions crash down on her. She had lost James. She was losing Nathan. And her marriage to Richard felt like a hollow shell. For the first time, she wondered if the escape she had found in James had been worth the cost. Months passed, and the dust began to settle. Nathan returned to college, though his relationship with Victoria remained strained. Richard remained oblivious, too wrapped up in his work to notice the tension in his family. And Victoria, she was left to pick up the pieces of her life. She started going to therapy, desperate to understand the choices she had made and find a way to move forward. Through her sessions, she realized that her affair with James hadn't been about love or even passion, it had been about filling a void. She had spent years sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family, and James had been her way of reclaiming a piece of herself. But now, she wanted more than fleeting moments of joy. She wanted to rebuild her life, to find happiness that wasn't dependent on someone else. Slowly but surely, she began to make changes. She started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago. She joined a local book club, reconnecting with her love of literature. And she even began having honest conversations with Richard about their marriage, though she stopped short of confessing the affair. As for James, he threw himself into his studies and his part-time job, determined to leave the past behind. But the lessons he had learned from his time with Victoria stayed with him. He realized that he didn't want a life built on secrecy and lies. He wanted something real, something lasting. One day, as he was walking through campus, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he saw a single line, "Thank you for everything. I hope you find what you're looking for." James smiled sadly, then deleted the message. It was time to move forward, for both of them.